Maya le moli matangi Whaapupula mai le ala ia tuai le nei folaunga Pelutia I puava le nei folaunga Peluta luta I fea le nei vasa O te tuva e luona o e o lotua O te savali pea o te leto e te paitua Po alava ni mala O matangi mafa Ele mawhai o na malu e lue ai Lua nganga ua na oe O te wha moe moe I ai Ia tau I manu e wholaunga Au noa ma le wha vai vai Lo mato tama oi le Maya le moli matangi Whaapupula mai le ala ia tuai manu le nei folaunga
We've got a lot of facts, a lot of stories, that will make this inquiry really powerful. It gives us the opportunity to know where we're actually sitting. Are we being paid our worth? I think it's crucial now because of the COVID-19 lockdown. A lot of our Pacific community are the frontline workers. We're the cleaners, we're the ones working in the factories, we're the ones that will take on those hard jobs. And I think it's about time that as Pacific people that we're listened to, we've got that voice. I think the systemic changes is once the report is released, it will make our government stop and listen, that it starts from the government. They set policy and legislation, and then it will filter down to our human relations policy, and then hopefully everything else will be fixed.
I definitely believe that I have experienced pay discrimination on the basis of my race, but the tricky thing is that there's a lack of transparency around pay. And around other contractual arrangements, which may make it hard to explain or to prove to someone who hasn't experienced this discrimination. But for many Pacific and for many Māori and minority communities, it's an instinctual feeling that we have that we're being taken advantage of. And it's also a very tough thing to talk about with the employer because culturally, we've been raised to be very humble and to not put ourselves forward or to not demand more than what we're given. So it's a very tough space in terms of appreciating what different types of employees bring. For Pacific peoples, we're often asked to carry the burden of a lot of cultural labour, unorthodox types of skills that workplaces appreciate and workplaces expect and need, but they're seen to be valued less. So I think if we transform the way that we think about skills, we think about what Pacific peoples are worth in terms of what they bring to workplaces, then we can go about addressing and closing that pay gap. I think the inquiry is absolutely crucial and necessary at this point in time. It always has been, but especially now where we're seeing, due largely to the pandemic, a lot of our youth are having to forego their education, having to leave school in order to take up work to help support their families. And that's a result of not only rising costs of living, but inadequate wages that our people are being paid. It's a serious impact on their future and their ability to provide not only for themselves, but their own families. So it's important for our kids, for our children, that we take action now. I think one of the most important systemic changes that we need to see is pay transparency legislation, where we can actually identify gaps within workplaces between employees that are Pacific and non-Pacific, and also along gender lines as well. Also to have accountability mechanisms for employers who aren't paying their employees equally along the lines of race and gender. So having that be put on the table and being championed by the Human Rights Commission and other key stakeholders will be incredibly important to addressing and closing the pay gap. Money in general is very difficult to talk about, and then when you add race, which is also an extremely difficult and sensitive issue, it triggers a lot of feelings and sensitivities, especially among Pākehā who don't want to be seen as racist. But it's important that we confront these institutional and personal biases that employers may have towards Pacific and other minority communities, because that does exist and it's important to talk about it. So normalizing those sorts of conversations is really crucial. I think it's absolutely essential for allies in unions and workplaces to come forward, because the Pacific pay gap impacts us all. When we're all not treated equally, it's not a successful, it's not a happy workplace where we're all able to perform our best and do our best work.
In regards to the Pacific pay gap, if you were to take a look at the statistics, it's actually quite shameful, the gap that exists between, in particular, Pacific women and everybody else. I actually don't think Pacific people realise how big the gap actually is. I know a lot of Pacific people who have been too afraid to negotiate what they think they're worth and have given that power to someone else. I think pay transparency could help, because basically it requires you to be transparent about what the baseline actually is for particular roles. And until you know that, you're kind of going into these roles blindly. If we're thinking about systemic changes, once again it starts from the top, and the government having to be the example and having to provide a level of standard, or perhaps mandated standards, or even legislation, introducing legislation. I think it's important for Pacific workers to get involved in the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry. It's an opportunity for them to voice what has been happening. It's an opportunity for them to know that they're not alone. Definitely a great opportunity for us to do something better, to be better in this space. For me, to be involved in the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry, it's always an honour and a privilege to be able to be trusted to hold the voices of people who have experienced some quite challenging experiences in their workplace, and it's an opportunity for us to honour those who took the risk to be able to come here to be able to build legacy for their family.
For me, I think racial discrimination and harassment are the ones that kind of resonate the most. I remember when I was first a law graduate, lots of what we'd call now microaggressions from colleagues. And I distinctly remember it was about 20 of us graduates sitting in quite a small space together. So, you know, we were in each other's space all the time. And for some reason they were talking about us being a family. And then they said, "Oh, but Lisa, you're the help." I just thought, wow, you know, like I was the only Pacific person in that cohort of graduates. And yeah, it really affected me, knowing that my peers viewed me that way, but also the fact that, you know, the supervisor never intervened. She never said anything. And I actually did raise it as an issue with the partners of the firm in a letter, and they just never responded. At the time, there was talk about sexual harassment. There was quite a lot of talk about it. This was 10 years ago. And then more recently, there's been all the talk, the Me Too movement and particularly sexual harassment around certain big firms. And I felt that as a young Pacific woman, racial harassment was actually far more of an issue for me than sexual harassment. I have experienced sexual harassment, but for me, the racial harassment was far greater an issue. And I've always kind of thought that, when's that issue going to come to the floor? When are we going to talk about racial harassment? I think there's a growing awareness of racism generally. Obviously there was the Black Lives Matter movement last year. There's long been treaty rights and movements around rights of tangata whenua, but there is still that hesitance around, I don't want to be seen to be raising the race card. I think it's about, number one, recognising it for what it is, and number two, supporting each other to have those conversations. And then number three, I think it's about employers being willing to listen and being willing to hear that your staff member might feel minoritised or racially harassed or culturally unsafe. We do hear that Pacific people are humble, and we hear that both from non-Pacific people and Pacific people themselves. But I would actually challenge that, because the other thing that we're hearing through the inquiry is that when Pacific workers do get the confidence to challenge equal pay issues, such as where they are being paid less than a colleague with exactly the same qualification and experience, when they raise that issue with their manager, they're told to mind their own business, to lump it or leave it. Why is that person being paid $5,000 less than their colleague with exactly the same skills and experience in the first place? That's actually on the employer, It's actually unlawful. It's already unlawful. But I think that employers need to look at themselves and challenge their biases and think about, what is it that makes them think that a Pacific person is worth less? I think it's the perfect time for us to be having this conversation. I think it's long overdue. Nobody wants to be called a racist, right? I understand that. But you do have to really challenge yourself. And I think you can start with the easy stuff like measuring ethnicity. Sometimes we meet with employers and they say, there's no ethnic pay gap here. And we say, okay, well, how do you know that? And they say, we think there isn't one, and it's clear that they haven't actually measured it. What are our values as a society? What kind of world do we want for each other and for our children? And do we want that to be one where all people, regardless of their ethnicity, can live with dignity, can have enough to provide for their children, have a decent home to live in, feel fulfilled by their jobs? Or do we want what's happening now, which is there's an increasingly a large segment of society who are the working poor, and they're struggling every day, and that's actually not good for them, and that's actually not good for all of us.
The Pacific pay gap is the difference between the highest income earners in New Zealand and the lowest income earners, and the lowest income earners are Pacific peoples. Everyone has a right to a life of dignity. We have a right to an adequate standard of living, but we know that Pacific children are overrepresented in the child poverty figures. If we're looking at people who are struggling to afford homes, struggle rents, Pacific people are concentrated, they're overrepresented. So for us to close this gap, we really need to address these inequities, and that is why we're doing this pay inquiry, because we want solutions as well as wanting to understand. And then those solutions and those recommendations we will then hand on to government, as well as talk to businesses so that they have some good practice to learn from. But we also want to build an understanding amongst our Pacific people that you are worth it. It matters now because our people are suffering. It matters now because New Zealand is not upholding its duty to ensure adequate living standards for all of our peoples. Poverty is not inevitable. Inequality is socially constructed. It is our duty as a government, as a society, to lift everybody up. This is about you, this is about your children, your life, You belong in New Zealand and you deserve the very best that this country can offer you.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the first report by the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry. I'm Lisa Mettle-Fox and I'm the project manager of the inquiry. To open our webinar today, I will be reading a Pacific proverb from Tonga. The proverb is on the subject of kinship and culture. Papata pe ka na e lalanga. It may be coarse in texture, but it was woven well. And that's what I think is true of the research that we are launching today. It may be hard to hear, but I think it was woven well and it's very important. And with that, I'll hand over to the Commissioner, Whanau Mali'i Kalanina Sumio.
Tēnā koutou katoa, whakalowhana iatu, malo elelei, malo ni, Māori, noa ia, whakatalo whātu, nisam bolavinaka, namaste, kia rana, malo le soifua, malo le soifua. Manuia, ko Whanau Mali'i Kalanina Sumio ahau. I am the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner, as Lisa has introduced me to you. Thank you very much for making the time to be here today on the launch of this report. It looks like this. This is the amazing piece of work that Dr. Gail Pacheco and her colleagues over at the New Zealand Work Research Institute conducted as part of the Pacific Pay Inquiry. It's one of the pieces of insights that we're leaning on to help us understand why we have these gaps and then what can we do to address them and address the inequities. Certainly from a human rights perspective, we all have the right to equal employment opportunity, including pay equity, the right to an adequate standard of living. And we actually have in our Human Rights Act 1993, there's a clause in section 22, where it is unlawful for an employer or anyone acting on behalf of an employer to offer less favorable conditions to someone compared to someone else. So we are talking about acts that are unlawful, and therefore we must not tolerate these acts. Pacific people have talked for many times about feeling overlooked for promotion and positions, or they put up their hand, they've proven their worth, their loyalty, their qualifications, their skills and experience, but unfortunately have not been able to achieve those steps to progression. So we really do need to address this. The picture that this piece of work has shown to us is not it's an ugly picture. But as Lisa said, we need to address it and take it forward. So before we go on any further, I just want to offer apologies from Rob Campbell due to unforeseen circumstances. Just suddenly he has to attend to other matters and cannot be here with us today. So apology from Rob. On the other hand, that gives us more time for Dr. Pacheco and Siriana to talk about the work and also to field your questions. So welcome everybody again and whaftai. So I'll now introduce Dr. Gail Pacheco, who's a professor of economics and director of the New Zealand Work Research Institute at the Auckland University of Technology. She's an applied econometrician with a passion for evidence-based analysis, particularly in the labor and health fields. In 2019, Dr. Pacheco was appointed as commissioner at the Productivity Commission and also received the AUT Medal AUT's Top Award for her research, scholarship, and application of integrated data to help inform social policy and well-being. So over to you, Gail.
Thank you for that, Karenina. And hopefully everyone can hear me, and hopefully I've been able to share my screen appropriately. So let me begin with saying thank you for the opportunity to present this research on Pacific Māori and ethnic pay gaps in New Zealand. And as Karenina said, I'm a professor of economics here at AUT and director of the New Zealand Work Research Institute. And it was a pleasure to do this work and contribute to the inquiry. I think it's a very important topic that needs urgent addressing. Okay. So the aim, and I've got 10 minutes to present, will be to give a bit of a brief overview of what we did and a few of the key findings. So in terms of what we did, our research aim was to try and explore what are the observable factors that contribute or help explain the ethnic pay gaps in New Zealand. And for that purpose, we use Stats New Zealand data, and in particular, we use the Household Labour Force Survey. It's a quarterly survey, and it's the June quarter each year that provides hourly earnings information. So for the main report and the analysis you see in that report that Karenina held up earlier, we used the June 2020 survey, but we also reran everything to check that results don't differ so much in 2019, just in case 2020 was affected by COVID in some way, because that was the start of the lockdown, etc. We focus in the study on the population age 16 to 64, and we do a number of other things to try and clean the data and remove outliers, such as trimming the top 1% and bottom 1% of hourly earnings information, just so that we make sure those outliers aren't influencing our analysis. Our main focus is to examine pay differences, so between Māori, Pacific, and Asian relative to Europeans. We can't look at some of the other groups because there isn't enough information to enable a large enough sample size. And because our analysis requires mutually exclusive groups, we need to prioritize ethnicity, and our order of prioritization has been used a number of times where we go Māori, Pacific, Asian, Mila, other, and then Europeans. So in terms of what is the pay disparity, our outcome of interest here is usual hourly total earnings from your main job. So we focus on the main job before tax. And when we examine this particular outcome, we see in June 2020 that European men had an average hourly wage of $35.72. In comparison to European men, for Māori men, their hourly wage was 19% lower. And for Pacific men, it was 24% lower. And for Asian men, 14% lower. And if we repeat the same thing, and this is just looking at the raw data, not looking at any observable factors yet, for European women, the average hourly wage was $31.34. In comparison, Māori women had an hourly wage that was 12% lower, Pacific 15% lower, and Asian 9% lower. So we can already see in just the raw data, before we look at any other characteristics, that irrespective of gender, Pacific have the lowest wage, whether we're looking at men or women. In terms of the method we use, and I'll mention up front that today I'm just going to concentrate on the Pacific pay gap, but in the report you can also go and see the results we present for the Māori European pay gap as well as the Asian European pay gap. So we analyze all three in the report and provide results on all three. But today I'll just focus on the Pacific pay gap. So that's the gap in the hourly wage between Pacific workers and European workers. And to understand that gap and to analyze that gap, we use what's called the Oaxaca blinder decomposition, which in layman's terms splits the wage difference into two components. One part is what can be explained by observable characteristics, things like there's educational differences. And the other part is what cannot be explained by those observable characteristics. And in terms of what we include in our observable characteristics, the rich data that we have from Stats New Zealand and the Household Labour Force Survey actually allows us to account for quite a few aspects along the lines of individual characteristics, household, job-related factors, what region you live in, and educational differences. So to give you just an example of a few, and this is not an exhaustive list, and you can go see the full list in the report as well, we include things like age, whether you were born in New Zealand, what your household income is, the structure of your family, if you're a sole parent household, what your education level is, and that's quite fine-grained, so we can see what impact there is if you don't have school qualifications versus school versus post-school versus bachelor's versus postgrad, various levels of education. We can see what occupation you're in, 9 levels of occupation, and also what industry you're in. And these are just, like I said, to name a few. There's many more variables we also include in the analysis. So for the results, and I should mention here that our results are done separately for men and women to look at the effects separately. And for men, we find after we control for all of those observable characteristics, the Pacific European pay gap is only 27% explained, and 73% cannot be explained. And for women, it's 39% explained and 61% not explained. So these are both the key results of the paper. If you want to take away one key finding from this report, this is the slide which has that one key finding, in that irrespective of gender, less than half of the pay gap can be explained by the long list of characteristics I just discussed. So can't be explained by individual, household, and job-related factors. And I think that's the key finding to take away from this research. If we now break down and try and understand what sits behind the explained and what could sit behind the not explained, sort of the blue versus the orange in this diagram. For the blue, the explained differences, the factors that come mostly to the fore are job-related factors, such as occupation and industry. And we know that Pacific workers are concentrated in particular industries and particular occupation. In the report, we show, for example, that 1 in 5 Pacific men work in manufacturing. More than 1 in 5 Pacific women work in healthcare and social assistance. And in terms of occupation, nearly 40% of Pacific men are laborers or machine operators or drivers. So they're heavily concentrated in particular occupations and industries. And in terms of the explained component, education also came up in the Pacific European pay gap for women. So what is the not explained? So this is the kind of a normal question we often get asked. What can constitute the not explained? Well, one is there could be some factors that we just haven't been able to account for in our model. I mean, we have a long list, but there could be additional things, maybe, for example, digital literacy, if I want to put an example out there. There could also be different preferences for the non-wage parts of the job, such as flexibility. There, of course, could be unconscious bias, and we know there's literature that points in this direction as well. And there's also literature that points in the direction of there could be discrimination in the labor market that can be contributing to this not explained. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, first up, Pacific workers of the ethnic groups that we examined had the highest pay disparity compared to the other ethnic groups relative to Europeans. So that's your first key conclusion. Now, the next thing is those pay disparities have huge impacts. It's not just impacts at the individual level. There's impacts on their families, impacts on their communities. It can have intergenerational impacts for these workers and their families. In terms of the explained part, we can do more to close the educational divide. We can do more to improve pathways to higher occupations. And in terms of the not explained, we need a lot more awareness of this. We need to work on the barriers that fall into that not explained. So what I want to conclude with overall is that if we make sure that there's fair opportunities for all, then we can lead to having more inclusive and diverse workplaces, and then Pacific workers can reach their full potential. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well. And if after the webinar you would like to ask more questions, I've provided my email address here too, plus a couple of locations at the Work Research Institute and the HRC website where you can find the full report. And with that, I think I'll leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Thanks heaps for that, Gail. So the report is, there's lots of detail in the report. So when you see it, there are lots of things that you can pull out from the report. For example, only about 7% of Pacific people occupy management positions compared to say 20% and above for Pākehā. So really, really useful report, and I highly recommend it. So we'll go on now to Dr. Siriana Naipi, who is a Pacific academic and advocate of Fijian and Pākehā descent. She is the research consultant for Mātara Research. She's also a lecturer at the University of Auckland and co-chair of the Early Career Research Forum. Siriana is dedicated to addressing and challenging systemic inequalities within academia through storytelling. She's published in the fields of higher education and Pacific research methodology. So, Siriana, the floor is yours.
Vanaka Karanina, I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you to everyone who's made it possible for us to all be in here. And Gail, I've loved reading through that report, and people who want to use data to make arguments for change. A lot of people believe in numbers, rightly or wrongly. They believe numbers can't lie, and I find that the types of reports that Gail's produced are the types of reports we can use for change. My role today is to kind of go through the literature review. So there is quite a comprehensive literature review behind as part of this project. And what I wanted to do today is to kind of go over the big picture things. But the slide is telling me to introduce myself, so I'll backstep a bit. Nisambula Vanaka, I'm Siriana Naipi. I'm named after my great-grandmother who raised my mother in the village of Nakinda in Naita City, Fiji. My mother migrated to Aotearoa in the late 60s, about 3 blocks over from where my house is where she grew up. We definitely don't have that house anymore. And my last name is that of my husband, whose family is from Avasali and Tamakatonga in Niue. Today, I'm going to go over the literature review broadly. I think importantly that it's really, once that's released, please take a look at it because it goes specifically into the industries that the inquiry focused on. So I want to start with the fact that Pacific people contribute really meaningfully to Aotearoa New Zealand's economy. We contribute $8 billion to New Zealand GDP. We have over 1,500 Pacific business employees, 500 not-for-profit organizations who have assets totaling $8.3 billion. And the reason I want to start there is because in reality, when we're talking about the Pacific pay gap, we're talking about a community who contributes to the economy and is not getting the same contribution back. So I want to dispel any myth that we are not contributing, and I believe the Ministry of Pacific Peoples has the big data set on how many volunteer hours. So this doesn't even include the amount of work we're doing that's not paid to prop up Aotearoa's economy. There's 4 things I'd like to focus on drivers for the pay gap. The first Gail's gone through, educational and job-related characteristics. So we know from Gail's work that this accounts for 27% for males and 39% for females of the pay gap. But what we also know is that there's some unaccounted for issues here. So one of the things that I'm an educationalist. I love the idea that education will solve all our problems, but the reality is our Pacific students experience a pay gap on graduation. And that's a really important thing to keep in the back of our mind, that we can't keep pushing this to the education system to solve, because the education system isn't going to solve it, as shown by Gail's numbers and through the literature review. I think when we talk about job-related characteristics, Gail gave a few examples. One of the things we can see in the research is that core public services and DHBs, Pacific peoples continue to be underrepresented in salaries over $100,000. And I understand that. I'm really excited to see questions about intersectionality, by the way, but I understand that that we all Pacific peoples exist in different socioeconomic status spaces, and that for some of us this is about tens of thousands of dollars, and for some of us this is about an hourly wage. And I really think we need to think about that as we move forward, how the pay gap impacts different spaces. But for example, the Ministry of Social Development, we know that more Pacific are in the front line. And one of the issues of being with frontline is that you have a particular ceiling. So that's really what we're talking about when we say educational and job-related characteristics. I also think we need to acknowledge the legislation gaps. So the Equal Pay Act of 1972 only accounts for gender, and the Employment Relations Act, not of 1972, sorry, that Karanina mentioned earlier, is difficult and often rejected on basis of insufficient evidence or inability to meet the threshold of justifiability. So while there is a law that says we can take personal action against an employer if we've been discriminated against, it's a really high bar to meet. And as of yet, there hasn't been a successful Pacific use of this law. And also, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I know we like to say bias because it feels less uncomfortable. So racism and bias, so structural, interpersonal, all those different things that come under that. One of the things the literature showed us is that Pacific peoples in Aotearoa New Zealand experience both perceived discrimination and structural racism. So this is talking about one-on-one, and this is talking about the sort of structural work in your workplace. And that these things are associated with poorer health and well-being, which ultimately impacts Pacific people's ability to live well. So this isn't about Pacific people feeling upset at their workplace. This is about experiencing racism and that having ongoing health and well-being ramifications for you. So it's not just that one-off moment, it's the sort of longitudinal impact of consistent microaggressions or consistent moments. I think Lisa's video earlier shared that story about being told she was the help. You know, that sort of consistent microaggressions as we go through our working life has an ongoing impact for our health and well-being. And I'm really excited that people brought up intersectional experiences in the questions. One of the things that's clear from the literature is that the Pacific community is heterogeneous, and not just in that we're from different Pacific islands, but that we have different socioeconomic realities. We have different migration realities. We have different gender realities. Our sexualities can impact how we experience this world. Our age can impact how we experience this world. And the sector that we work in impacts how we experience this world. And so I'm really excited to see that already people are going, hang on, wait. And so I know from working with the team that that's a really big part of this picture. And I think that comes through in the literature review, is how do our intersectional experiences shape what the pay gap looks like for us. And then there's a few solutions that came up for the pay gap through the literature review. So one is addressing educational attainment and or occupational status. So even though it accounts for a section of the pay gap, that doesn't mean we throw out education. It doesn't mean we throw out mentoring into management. It means that we acknowledge that that's probably the first and in some ways the easiest step to take. It's easy to do mentoring programs to lift our management roles. It's a little bit easier to fix access to education. but those are those, so we don't throw them out, we use them in relation to other solutions. Internationally, we've found that comprehensive pay transparency and mandatory reporting has had a really good impact on the pay gaps that are faced overseas, gender and ethnic. So comprehensive pay transparency means that you know how much you get paid for a specific role with specific experience. It means understanding how much your colleague who has the same experience, the same qualifications is being paid, as opposed to pay secrecy, where you have no idea. And for me, this is quite personal. I didn't know that I was experiencing a pay gap until one of my colleagues mentioned it to me and told me how much she was earning. And so I think that that's a really powerful tool. And mandatory reporting means that businesses collect the data, they look at the data, and then they're able to see where the gaps are. So this isn't about placing blame. It's about having an understanding about what our work spaces look like. It's about understanding, I guess, if you first of all, if you don't collect the data, you don't know that you have a problem. But if you collect the data, you're able to pinpoint where those problems are. Is it in how you recruit? Is it where Pacific people are employed within your workplace? Is it that Pacific people might need some professional development? Is it that your human resources team might need some professional development? So it's about working out where to best invest your resources. We could amend the Equal Pay Act, but that also, I think, aligns with the Fair Pay Agreements. So there's a couple of things we could do within New Zealand legislation that the literature review goes into more detail about. And then the hardest one, I think, is meaningfully addressing racial and intersectional bias. And the reason this is the hardest is because it's kind of this thing that there's no easy solution, right? It's not just about X number of Pacific in these roles. It's about retraining how we think about Pacific peoples. And the story that I often share to help people understand why you might have bias against Pacific peoples, even though you have a Pacific friend, is because Pacific peoples in the 60s, there's the history of colonization in the Pacific with New Zealand. And when you go through government reports from that time, it was a really paternalistic relationship. Then we have Pacific migrating to Aotearoa to fill a labor shortage gap, and in really specific industries that Pacific people could do because the New Zealand government had a role in deciding what education systems were happening in the Pacific. So ensuring that we were trained for labor, then bringing us over to fill a labor gap. And we've all got some more awareness now about the dawn raids and how that's further contributed to how people understand Pacific people. And then the RSC is another piece of this puzzle, right? So I guess what I'm trying to do is raise awareness to all these different moments where Pacific people in the New Zealand imaginary have been seen as fulfilling labor shortages, as opposed to maybe running the company, maybe being the manager, right? In our imaginary as a collective people, Pacific people fulfill very specific things. And that's why that meaningfully addressing racial and intersectional bias is really hard, because it's not an easy solution. That's my very quick, how do you summarize 50 pages in 8 minutes? But I've truly, oh no, I've got one more. What can you do? Sorry, Karanina. The 3 things that I want you to take away from this is talk about your pay. Talk about your pay to your colleagues. Talk about how much you're earning. Talk about what qualifications and experience you have. Find out one-on-one, if you can, if you're experiencing a pay gap. And if you're not Pacific, tell your Pacific colleagues. I think Dylan's video earlier on talked about how it's real awkward. Get past being awkward, because awkward means that you're losing money and your family and your community and not being paid their worth. So we're going to get past feeling awkward and we're going to start talking to each other about it. Advocate for structural change. If you are in rooms where you can say, have you seen the Pacific pay gap? Have you seen this report that Gail's put out? Do that, please. Tell people about this work. I think it's really important. And be that advocate that says this isn't good enough. How do we make it better? So no pressure, but if those of you who are here, there's 130 of you, if you could change the world for us, really appreciate it. Otherwise, that's me, Karanina. Thank you so much.
No, it's really awesome. And as I said, we do have time. So it was really great to hear you talk about, share as much as you can about the literature review. So just so our people know, the literature review will also be coming out at some point. I mean, the good thing about the inquiry is that it's opened the door for us to look at the ethnic pay gap generally. I mean, so as Gail's data has shown, you know, we look at tangata whenua and also our Asian brothers and sisters as well as Pacific. I mean, we're talking about around 30% of our population are non-Pākehā. So this is really important work. So the work that we do to address inequity, focusing on Pacific, of course, will help lift and address inequities that are associated with ethnicity and discrimination, be it around race or so forth. So this is really, really important work. So I just want to say, Vinaka Vakalevu Seriana, for that succinct summary of our literature review. And now I think we've got a lot of questions. I'll just now hand it back to Lisa, who will facilitate the discussion. And I'm happy to talk the least out of the three of us.
Taitile Lava, Sono Mali'i, and Siriana and Gail. Wonderful presentations from you both. And I am happy to say we have a lot of questions flooding through. So to the audience, please keep them coming. If you would like to see the answer to a specific question, then please hit the thumbs up, and that kind of upvotes the question. So I can see who wants to see the answer to which questions in particular. This first most popular question is for you, Gail, I think, and it's about intersectionality, and I'll just read it straight from the Q&A. Have diverse gender identities been factored into the research? E.g., are we able to measure the disadvantages that trans and intersex Pacific people face? As they imagine there would be an added disparity, will there be a commitment to deeper exploration of this issue moving forward?
Yes, I can answer that one. So no, it unfortunately hasn't been able to be factored in because the sample we're working with, the Household Labour Force survey, is a survey in itself. So as soon as you start to drill down to smaller groups, there isn't enough sample to kind of cut it a lot of different ways. Plus, it's not measured in the Household Labour Force survey whether an individual, they're not asked if they're trans or intersex as far as I know. But the hope is in the future, so with the next census, they're going to ask a lot more questions to look at diverse gender identity. So the next census that's in 2023. And as more wage information in the administrative data improves, then we can do a lot more things where we can measure different layers of disadvantage and advantage to understand particular subpopulations.
Thank you. I think another question for you, Gail. Was it possible to break down the analysis by different ethnic groups within Pacific?
I think it's along the same lines that because we're using a survey, so we have within our survey, I think one of the questions I saw, a separate question was asking about sample size. And within our survey, about 10,000 are European and about 1,000 are Pacific. And then, you know, the Pacific, you know, you already break it down to 500 for men versus women. And then if you try to break it down further into particular Pacific groups, then you won't get enough confidence in the results and they won't be credible enough. So unfortunately not, but in the future that may be possible if we get better wage data at the population level as hours information starts to improve in the administrative data we're working with.
Great, thank you. And I think this question would be best answered by you, Sono Mali'i. So do you feel there is an issue around employers not understanding, supporting the whānau/ainga responsibilities that our Pacific peoples face outside of employment?
Certainly, if we're talking about a small business or an SME where they work very, very closely with their staff, I think, you know, there's a good relationship that employers have with their staff. I'm not sure in terms of the larger, you know, the larger workplaces, whether that knowledge, especially the knowledge at executive level, is held. So I do think, you know, there's a lot of work to be done there. You know, when we recruit our managers, you know, the people who make decisions about pay, let's face it, what do they know about Pacific people? What do they know about human rights? You know, is there some way that that a support or some work can be done so that, you know, people going in at those levels have a basic understanding of Māori, of our Asian, of our Pacific brothers and sisters, so that when they're engaging with them, they're engaging with the whole person. You know, one of the things we hear from Pacific is, you know, they're tired of being a commodity. You know, I'm here to do the hours for you, and that's all you care about. So, you know, it does matter to them that that you feel that you value them as employers, and that they feel a sense of belonging. You know, most Pacific people who've engaged with the inquiry, you know, they love their jobs, you know, that sense of purpose, you know, the family. But, you know, with family, we need to treat everybody fairly and with decency. So when that care for your Pacific staff isn't there, they sense it acutely. And especially when they see others progress ahead of them, it's not a good thing.
We do have quite a few questions about the specifics of the analysis, Gail. I think we can probably go through and kind of try and answer them together. So there's questions around, was there a difference for workers employed by Pacific-led organisations and the pay there is in comparison to fully non-Pacific organisations? And there's quite a few questions around quite specific matters like that, which, yeah, I thought maybe you could answer kind of together.
Yes, in general, we haven't been able to break it down that way because, like I said, it's a small survey, the household labour force survey, that doesn't allow you to do that. But yeah, in the future, I think it'd be good to look at more of these questions, and it's really good to see these questions, because then in the future, when we do more work, which we may potentially do with wider population data, we can try and break it down, because we know where the interest is in terms of breaking it down by particular businesses or particular industries. We didn't include, I saw there was one on collective agreements versus individual agreements. We don't have that particular data, but we did include whether the individual was on a permanent contract or not as one of the variables in the model too.
I'm just wondering, Seliana, did you see anything in the lit review around that? And then I'll come in with the learning that we've got from other parts of the inquiry.
Yeah, so we do see in the literature review the importance of taking into account these different pieces around, are you permanent, are you part-time? We see internationally that that's quite a big piece of the puzzle. And then we see in the specific, so there's been a number of pay gap studies in specific industries, mostly, unfortunately, mostly in kind of more privileged spaces, I guess, like the universities. But and that in particular kind of says we need to talk about precarity, we need to talk about gender more, genders more, we need to talk about sexuality and those sorts of pieces. I think sadly we don't have that information, and I'm excited to hear from Gail that the data collected is going to expand, because that's part of the problem, right? You can't report on it if you don't have the data. Yeah.
I should have added that we also account for part-time status as well in the model. Yes.
Certainly, is there a difference between Pacific-owned businesses and non-Pacific? You know, there's an assumption perhaps that a Pacific-owned business has the structures and you know, human resource discipline to ensure that inequity doesn't occur, but that's not the case. And we'll talk a bit more about that when in the Pacific pay gap, that the full report comes out. A lot of Pacific businesses are small businesses. You know, if they're tendering for services, you know, the value of contracts, by the time it's gotten to the small businesses, they're left with very little to pay, you know, to pay their staff and compete for staff. So that business environment, the procurement process also impacts but the way that Pacific people can compete for talent. But certainly in terms of issues around pay transparency or the lack of, that Pacific businesses also struggle with that. We would like to think that recording ethnicity of Pacific staff by Pacific businesses and non-Pacific businesses will be something that we can look forward to. We often hear from businesses that it's hard to identify, hard to collect the data from around ethnicity data, but I generally think if you look around the room, you know who's non-European in your office or your workplace. I don't think it's that hard. The Public Service Commission has put out a tool that I suggested everyone in the public sector, in the private sector, look up. Taxpayer money has been spent to develop these tools. So please look it up so that in future we're measuring apples with apples and not all sorts of different standards of measurement of ethnicity. So just a short response to that. Lisa.
Thank you. And we've had a number of people asking about the explained and not explained breakdown by industry. So I would just like to say quickly that we can measure that the actual pay gap in industries just from Statistics New Zealand data. But in terms of the explained and not explained, which is what Professor Gale's research is about, would you like to answer that question, Gale, please? And then Siriana, I know there were some things in the literature review about that as well, please.
Yeah, no, so yeah, we haven't been able to break it down by industry, but yes, again, this is one of those areas where I think it would be useful to do it at the population level in the future. And I think there's huge interest in doing it both at the gender level and for ethnic pay gaps to understand specifics within each industry. And I know a number of organizations are interested in that space too.
Yeah, and I think so the literature review has data on the specific industries of focus. So for instance, we know that the construction industry is the 4th largest employer of Pacific people, and the average hourly wage of non-construction workers has steadily increased, but Pacific workers in the industry, it's fluctuated. So Pacific construction workers are on average paid $25.42 per hour, compared to non-Pacific construction workers who are paid $29.44. So that if you're a Pacific construction worker, your pay gap has more than doubled from 6% in 2010 to 14% in 2018. And within manufacturing, there is, sorry, I'm having to find the report because I don't remember numbers very well. So within, for manufacturing, the average hourly wage of the Pacific manufacturing workers is $22.58, compared to non-Pacific manufacturing workers who are paid $29.74. So it's a pay gap of 24%, which has remained steady since 2010, and it's higher than the across industry average of 22%. And then if we go through to healthcare, Pacific healthcare workers, so the average hourly wage of a Pacific healthcare worker has increased significantly since 2010, and it currently sits at $25.22. However, this is still lower than non-Pacific healthcare workers, whose average hourly wage is $32.29. So while the gap has decreased by 9% since 2010, it remains at 22%, which is the same as across industry. So the questions around, are there industry-specific gaps, is very clearly, yes, there are, and that those change over time and they fluctuate. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at with the literature review around understanding that there's a specificity and a different experience of the pay gap dependent on what industry you're in. And that's a really important take-home message, I think, is that it really does depend where you're employed as to what your pay gap looks like.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that, Lisa, if that's useful? In other research we've done on the Pacific labour market too, that we're going to release next week with MB, where we're looking at the impact of COVID. And one of the things we did was we also looked at monthly earnings by different education levels to see if, how much of it could be explained, another way of trying to get at, how much is education explaining some of the difference. And for Pacific men in particular, even when you broke it down, you were comparing Pacific men with school qualifications versus European men with school qualifications, Pacific men with postgraduate versus European men with postgraduate, there were still large pay disparities in terms of monthly earnings, even when you broke it down to those educational levels. So it's not just at the industry level, but it was also for Pacific men, at least, at the educational level as well.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And I would say, just following on from Siriana's comments, that yes, there are differences in industries, and sometimes there's differences in the method that's used to calculate pay gaps, and whether or not you use average or median. But whatever way you cut the data, Pacific are at the bottom, very closely followed by Māori. And that's any indicator. Unfortunately, Pacific and Māori share the bottom of the bar graph is sometimes how we talk about it. So yes, obviously, the numbers and all that is very, very important. But I think a key message is that we are at the bottom. We know that. We're looking into why. And the next thing is to do something about it. So I do have quite a popular question here, which is for you, Gail, which is about someone who saw another presentation where Māori Pacific representation in NEET rates was overrepresented due to higher birth rates. To what extent did this factor come up in the explained and not explained factors?
So because we're looking just at employed workers, so we're looking at pay gaps for those who are employed. So we're not looking at if their needs are not in employment or education or training, but we do try and adjust for your likelihood to be in the labor market, so your likelihood to actually enter the labor market. So we do something to deal with that selection bias, because we know that the reasons why you might not enter the labor market are highly associated or correlated with the reasons that might, or the factors that might determine your wage rate. So we do adjust for that in the model to deal with that sample selection issue.
Thank you. I think this next question would probably be well answered by you, Sono Mali'i, which is about an organisation which is saying that it can only do an annual review of the gender and ethnic pay gaps due to the cost of the review being undertaken, and whether or not there's a way that could be cheaper for organisations so that it can be done perhaps on a quarterly or ongoing basis.
I think, I would welcome probably a one-to-one discussion with our questioner in terms of the costs, because that would really help our discussions with government and with business associations in terms of costs. If it's a small or medium enterprise, versus a large corporate like Vodafone or some, the costs can be quite significant. So I'm really interested, perhaps offline, in terms of how much is it costing you to do that, and to see if there's a way that that can be addressed, and also if there's a really good model, so that the same model can be used. Especially, I'm thinking about our SMEs who don't have HR departments and that sort of thing. So how can we support our small businesses to also come on the journey with us to address this big problem? So if you don't mind sharing your links with us, the Human Rights Commission will be in touch. Thank you very much. Another thing, at the board level, I mean, it'd be really good if at the board level they have a commitment to addressing the ethnic pay gaps. So requesting maybe 6 monthly reports in terms of where things are at and any progress made in terms of appointments of Pacific, Māori or Asian people onto management roles and that sort of thing. Those are things that I've heard from large employers, that they're trying to do that so they can begin the journey to try and identify the issues, and then get a commitment all the way to board level as well in terms of addressing this. But in terms of the cost, we'll follow up that discussion with the question. I think that's a really good question.
Great, and I'll just open this up to all three panelists. I think you might all have something to say about this. Siriana, and then that's Gail, and then Sono Mali'i. Differences between the public and private sector.
I mean, from looking at the literature, the biggest difference really is that the public sector has something in place to talk about pay gaps for gender and ethnicity. As Karanina said earlier, the Public Services Commission has actual guidelines on how to calculate these things and what you can do, whereas private sector, we don't have compulsory yet or mandatory. You can kind of volunteer to keep your gender pay gap information public, and we don't yet have it for ethnic pay gap. And so I think that there is a very real difference between how public employees and private employees experience advocating for the Pacific pay gap or advocating to close the gap. Some of us are fortunate enough to have tools to say this is the thing, and others, and the other thing is I'm a researcher by day. I get paid to research the things that annoy me about my job. That's a privilege that most people don't have. If you work in manufacturing, you are not being paid to advocate for yourself. In fact, sometimes you have to take time off to go to a union meeting. And so I think that that's a really important picture. I'm a qualitative researcher by trade, so I get really excited when there are talanoa and things like that around this sort of information. And so I think something like that would give us a better understanding of how people experience it in the private versus public.
I might just add to that, completely agree with all that Siriana was just saying, and that's why, given that difference between public and private in terms of the guidelines, that's where more pay transparency would be really useful, right? So some of the kind of things that Karanina has been advocating for could really help bridge some of that divide in that space as well.
And just jump in, so the work that's going on at the Public Service Commission is for the core public service, so it's yet to branch out to Crown entities. But one of the things that's really important part of that work is when they identify inequities, then they address it, i.e. people have received pay adjustments. It's not just we've got a problem, let's do better going forward. They've remedied the inequity, and that's really, really important. So for the private sector, I mean, I think reaching out to the public sector to see, to get some good practice or some useful hints, I think I would recommend that. And as I said before, some tools have been developed already, they've been tested already. Try and save yourself some money and some time, and reach out to the public sector for their tools to hopefully help you on your journey going forward.
Thank you all for your answers. And this is the final question that we'll have time to ask today. But I would just like to say that we will put all the questions that we have left to our panelists, who hopefully will have time to answer them. And so hopefully we also have your emails attached to your questions. If you're anonymous, unfortunately, we won't, it's my understanding, but if not, then we will. So there's a question here, and I think Siriana, actually, you're pretty well placed to answer this, and then potentially Sono Mali'i, you might have something to say, and of course Gail as well. But Siriana, I know that you are a union delegate and part of the Pacific whānau for your union. So the question is, I am part of a union and they are pushing for women's pay equity, but I personally feel that the priority and data evidence says we should be pushing for ethnicity pay equity. How or what can I say to articulate this point? I have been pushing this for over 5 years.
I'm right there with you. One of the reasons that Lisa and I think, came into contact was partly in our shared frustration that we are prepared to talk about gender, but not talk about ethnic pay gaps. Partly this is because of how unions are structured and their voting. So the best thing we can do is get more Pacific and more allies to so we need more Pacific members, but we also need more allies to say, actually, we need to talk about this, it needs to be on the table. And so unfortunately, there's quite a lot of, there's a lot of unpaid labor that will go into getting our unions to recognize that when you just talk about gender, you're saying ethnicity doesn't matter. And you know, that's how I feel as a Pacific woman, that when the union says we're going to talk about gender and we're going to put that on the table, it's going to be part of our negotiations, I kind of go, well, if the data says that I get paid the least out of everyone, why are we not talking about gender and ethnicity? Why can't we advocate for both? Because if there's only space to advocate for one and you choose to prioritize gender, you're telling me who's more important, and it's not me, if that makes sense. And so this is my favorite rant, so I will try and pull it back a bit. But quite genuinely, I'm a little bit heartbroken every time I see the unions push for gender and ethnicity. And I understand there's legal frameworks that enable that conversation to be easier, and there's only so many things that unions can ask for. But I think that the ethnic pay gap needs to be one of those things. Otherwise, why would Pacific and Māori continue to be members of a union that doesn't serve them, that doesn't see them as an important priority group, and would just like us on their posters? I'm not saying that that's what the TU does. That's my union. They do other things. But I do think that those are the questions we have to start asking really awkwardly at our union gatherings. Is, are you only happy when I'm on your poster, but you don't want to advocate for me? You're not going to make many friends, but you and I can hang out in the no friends table together.
Gail, perhaps you go and I'll go last.
I just want to say I echo everything she just said. I don't think I need to add to it. I think she said it beautifully. And yeah, I think both equally important. We need to and that's why measuring it was really important, to make sure we have data on both. We need to continue advocating. I've done work on the gender pay gap as well, and I continue to push in both these spaces equally. And yeah, both hugely important. Fully thumbs up to Siriana, and agree with your rant. It's a well-reasoned rant.
Yeah, I mean, you know, our unions have been champions for human rights. You know, that's their history. That's why we've progressed. We've achieved, you know, so many rights for workers. And now what we can say to the unions, here's the information. You cannot say that you don't have the information now, because here it is. And so it's really timely that the Pacific pay gap is happening now. And we're not just focusing on our Pacific whānau, we're talking about, you know, everybody really. So it's really important. The information is here. To not act would signify a tolerance for social and economic oppression of significant parts of our country. And that's not the Kiwi way. So we deserve the best that this country can give, and we expect our unions to fight for everyone. So that's my suggestion to the questioner. You're not alone. You can hear the voices on this panel. We have the information now, and there's more work being done. The mana wahine claim work is also happening. It's, you know, so the call out for equality and equal opportunity for all of our peoples is loud and clear. And to go forward, only advocating from gender is a willful neglect of responsibility. Whakatai.
Thank you so much to our panelists for coming today. And now our question time is over, unfortunately. So Mara'i, would you like to make some concluding remarks?
Yeah. Well, I want to say, Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you so much to our amazing speakers. I really just wanted you to just keep talking and talking. And it's great to see so many people participate. So clearly the interest there, people want to do better. You know, we're a country, we're ready to do better. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done to contribute to the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry, and to all of our people there on listening in. Make noise, make very loud noises, disrupt, go beyond the awkwardness, as Siriana has said. But this is our time. This is our time. So I wish you well. Please be safe, and you know, all the best to everybody. Whakatai Lisa, over to you.
Yes, so thank you again so much to our panelists and our audience for joining us today with this groundbreaking research. everyone in the audience, if you could please keep an eye on our website and sign up to our newsletter, because this is the first of 3 reports which will be coming out. So a literature review and of course our final overall inquiry report will be published in the next couple of months. And if you're on our newsletter list, then you'll be the first to know. And I'd just like to close our webinar today with a Cook Island proverb. Makakati ko e te akari kakati me taki ia te puru. When you husk the coconut with your teeth, make sure you have a good hold on the husk. And that's what I feel like we're all in the business of doing here today. We're getting all the research together. We're talking to all the people, communities, our unions, our employers, government. And after this, we're going to be moving forward to implement the recommendations that come out of this. So please do keep in touch. This is just the beginning.
Lande mai unde no, elo mani ringingo, satawi, sataso, satasota soro, tavatale sabo, aungai kaya lo sare, satotoka lei. Tombo tuka ikonga, tona singa watanga, satawi, satandre. Toca lei.